All right, so the first thing that we had on the agenda today, thanks for joining the call, we're going to be focused on the political movements post-World War II. So we will kind of back into it a little bit of what's going on post-World War II, or right towards the end of World War II, and then we will do a quick overview beyond that. I do, by the way, want to also point out that I know this at the very beginning, we're going over this very quickly, and what my hope is to do is to quickly cover these things from a really high level, and then we can do much more of a targeted review and to prepare you guys for the exam. But also it gives us a great chance to, if you guys have questions, or if there's something you're like, hey, I looked at this, let's do that more in depth. I'm hoping that kind of doing the quick overview at the beginning gives us time to do that. So I do anticipate us doing some more depth to some of these topics here as we go. And by the way, I'm getting on a call tonight at 6 p.m. with College Board. So College Board has their big call tonight that's supposed to give us more detail. So I should be able to provide you guys more specifics as to what the actual test will look like after tonight. So that's good as well. So let's start it off by talking about where I am. So you guys see the action that's going on behind me here. Does anybody know what this event is a reference to?
Nope.
Oh, come on. So this right here is the 1960 presidential debate. Now, what's interesting about it is not that they debated, okay? There had actually been debates prior to Nixon and Kennedy. What's unique about this is it's the first time there was a TV debate. And things are going to be very different in the political scheme from this point on, okay? And we're going to get into that today, but the 60s, you're going to see a definite change of when most people are getting their politics on TV rather than radio, okay? There is a distinctive moment that occurs in 1960 at this debate. So we're going to, like I said, we'll kind of back into that. So I do want to start with the question that Braxton asked towards the end of the call, Tuesday, that he wanted us to get into is more of the Bay of Pigs invasion and a timeline in Cuba. So I'm going to go ahead and start there. So the first thing is to give some background here. It's actually going to lead right into this debate because part of the issue at play here was that Fidel Castro was an enemy of the United States. From the early 50s, he spoke about the United States as his enemy, that he wanted to destroy them, that he was a communist leader. And so Eisenhower and his vice president, Nixon, actually had a plan to go in and kill Fidel Castro. The only problem was they didn't get it done in time. So it's fascinating. During this debate, JFK actually hits him with this a lot, going, well, you didn't even do anything about Castro. And Nixon has to sit there and just take it because, they did have a plan, but they didn't do it, okay? So Nick Kennedy comes in, he gets this plan the CIA developed. It's a fascinating plan. Again, Bay of Pigs, if you ever want to look into that, I would definitely tell you to look further. It's one of the biggest military disasters in American history. So I'll give you the long and short of it. Long and short of it is we decide there are all these exiles that left Cuba, went to Florida. We train them. We tell them we're going to send them back to Cuba, and they're going to create an insurrection. Okay, so they're just going to completely overthrow the government. There's about 2,500 of them. We tell them we're going to give them several weeks to do this. So CIA sends them back to Florida. Sends them from Florida to Cuba, and then within a week we lose contact with them. So the CIA tells Kennedy, look, we can't contact these guys. We need to go ahead and get the ball moving. Like, if we can't talk to them, we need to go ahead and just like launch the full scale, like send a signal over there and tell them they need to launch the attack immediately. Kennedy pushes back and says, well, we told them we'd give them several weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. CIA says, but look, with no communication, that's really not going to work. So they send a message to the exiles to go ahead and launch this resurrection. Well, so they do, and it fails miserably. As a matter of fact, within 48 hours, most of them are captured. The CIA had told them we would give them air supply and naval supply. Well, when it looked like they were getting captured rather quickly, we decided not to give them that supply because then we were kind of stuck in this weird spot. And so it is a disaster. I mean, they capture our exiles. The Cuban Fidel Castro comes out and says, hey, we stopped this. The United States tried to kill me. They can't kill me. You know, I'm smarter than they are. It's just and Kennedy comes out and gives a really fascinating speech in which he says, victory has many fathers, but failure is often an orphan. You know, like, hey, when something goes wrong, everyone's like, hey, it wasn't my fault, somebody else's fault. Kennedy takes complete blame for it. It's rather interesting, right? It's probably kind of rare that you actually hear that. You know, so a leader come out and say, yep, that's my fault, but he does say it's never going to happen again. So fast forward to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Cuba decides that they're going to bring nuclear missiles from Russia into Cuba, the CIA actually makes recommendations to Kennedy to put troops on the ground in Cuba to go get the nuclear weapons, to go invade and take them back. And Kennedy says no. Kennedy goes with his plan to actually blockade Cuba and force this confrontation that, of course, ends up being pretty successful, you know, avoiding a nuclear war. But it is an interesting take that Kennedy says, post Bay of Pigs, I'm going to ultimately make the call. Okay, I take recommendations from the CIA, from the FBI, but ultimately I'm going to make the decision because guess what? If this goes south, I'm going to be the one to blame for it. So that's kind of the timeline there. Bay of Pigs goes south, doesn't work very well. It's a disaster. And then Kennedy has this moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis where, again, he avoids a nuclear war. So just to kind of keep that timeline straight, I think that was a good question from Braxton, that we make sure that we know that happened first. The disaster happened that made Cubans feel like they could take us on more directly, that we really couldn't do anything about it, that we were embarrassed. And so that's when they moved nuclear weapons into Cuba. So that's a good question. So now let's talk politics for a second here. 1950s, post-World War II. We very quickly realized from the last conversation, as I started that discussion off with the picture behind me of Yalta, and very quickly after World War II, you hear Winston Churchill start the warnings that, look, the Russians are the next threat. Yeah, they helped us beat the Germans, but you know, for those of you who just got out of world history, what was the final line of the Communist Manifesto? Anybody remember that top of their head? Workers of the world unite. Not of Russia, not of China, but the world. And that's important because it's a global movement. So part of what Western leaders were concerned about was communism spreading all over the country, specifically in America. So if you'll notice, the second question I had there on the call today was about Eisenhower's presidency. So Eisenhower, a lot of his presidency is dealing with the Red Scare. So they call it the Red Scare because the Russian flag is red, and it kind of becomes the connotation of communism and the spread of it. So there's a figure named Joseph McCarthy that comes out, and you're going to hear the term McCarthyism. You actually hear that used a lot today in politics. If you hear that term today, what do people usually mean by that? Have y'all heard that in politics today? If someone calls someone, says that they're guilty of McCarthyism, what do they really mean by that? What do they accuse them of in today's terms? Oh, what was that? Oh, somebody said like exaggerating a threat. Yes, you're right. Yeah, so if you accuse someone of that, that becomes a term that is, there's a threat, but you've greatly exaggerated it. A senator named Joseph McCarthy goes around and he says that he knows there's over 200 people who work in the United States government that are Russian spies. By the way, there does turn out to be multiple people that are in the government that are Russian spies, but does he have a list of 205 of them? No, he doesn't. So for a long time, he begins to be a very popular figure because he's very anti-communism. He's going to protect America. But as time goes on and people figure out he's exaggerating, he's censured by the Senate. You can't really kick someone out, but you can censure them, which means that the whole Senate thinks that you're undeserving of your office. After that, He does not run for re-election, and then he dies. He's in his mid-50s when he dies. I mean, it's just this really tragic. People thought he was going to be president, and he goes from potentially being the next president to being out of the Senate and dead. But because people saw that he exaggerated that threat. So again, now let's go back to the picture here behind me. So that sets up an interesting dynamic. We talked about the Cold War on Tuesday. We talked about Eisenhower attempting to have a better relationship with the Russians, but our spy plane being shut down. So you got Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. Okay, again, he's got a tremendous background here. He seems to be the next person in line to be president. He was a vice president for a very popular president. But then, on the other hand, you have a young Democrat named John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy comes in. By the way, his biography is very interesting if you want to look more into Kennedy. At first, he's a terrible speaker. His campaign manager early on talks about he's such a bad speaker that he would sometimes just quit in the middle of a speech and walk off. That's how bad he was. And as time goes on, he develops into one of the most powerful speakers we've ever seen. And so when they run for office, it is an incredibly close race. So they agree to do this television interview. This television debate goes down in infamy because, for one, Nixon refuses to wear any makeup. Okay, he's like, hey, I'm a guy, I don't wear makeup, kind of that old bravado, like, nope, not going to do it. JFK is all about putting the makeup on. JFK also loved to do, one of his things he liked to do was he would go yachting. So very tanned, okay? It's got the extra makeup on. And then you got Nixon, who had actually been sick, who refused any makeup. And those TV camera lights go on. If we have anybody in theater, the reason why you wear a lot of makeup is they say when those lights come on, it just like makes you, really pale. It really kind of, whatever. So everybody says on the radio, they do a survey, and the majority of listeners think that Nixon won the debate. But overwhelmingly, the people who watched it on TV thought Kennedy won the debate. And as you look down at the debate, you can watch it on YouTube. It's really interesting to see. Kennedy is very smooth, very calm. He looks very good, too. Nixon is very robotic. Again, you kind of have the pale. He's really sweaty. And it makes him look kind of like nervous. I mean, if you just watch it, it really does look like he's kind of nervous in the debate. And Kennedy looks very calm. And from this point on, you really have this change in politics where people are very concerned, political figures are very concerned with how they come across, what they look like in a debate setting. Not just the way they say things, but how they look saying them, what their body language is like. And again, as you guys get into politics and you look at these new elections, as you look at this 2020 election, when people watch a debate and when political analysts watch a debate, they talk a lot about the way the candidates looked, who looked more confident, who looked more appealing, who looked like they were confident. That's something that people really place a lot of importance on. So, incredibly close election, JFK wins. By the way, Nixon still, all the way to his dying day, refused to believe he lost. Okay. He thought that he got cheated, particularly out of Chicago. He felt like there was a lot of hijinks going on in Illinois. But that's another story, okay? But so very close, Kennedy wins. As Kennedy wins, you have the shift in the political dynamic. So Kennedy really wants to do a lot of civil rights legislation. Kennedy also he talks about the new frontier. If you guys, Kennedy has one of the few really famous inauguration speeches, okay? You're going to see a very aspirational president. You have a lot of comparisons. I heard, last go around to President Obama. You heard President Obama always spoke with this kind of, he was young, energetic, and he always had this real, hey, we can really achieve these great things. You saw, again, a lot of comparisons were made between him and JFK. JFK was very similar in that dynamic. But JFK is really going to push civil rights, space race, and again, as we talked about in the last lesson, a particularly more aggressive involvement in Vietnam as well. Okay, so those are your big issues that you're going to see in the Kennedy presidency. Now, of course, as much as we hear about Kennedy, Kennedy isn't even president for 3 years. Just a little over 2.5 years, and in 1963, he's going to be assassinated. Now that, again, I'd love to go into more depth with that at another time if we wanted to go full JFK conspiracy. So maybe that should be like our own little conversation there to do that one day. So JFK is assassinated in 63. We then go to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, becomes president and decides what he's going to do is he's going to take the Kennedy agenda and go on steroids. I'm going to do this super speed. So civil rights, let's go 100 times faster. Let's go. Civil Rights Act is going to be passed multiple times. You got one in 65, you got one in 67. You're going to see a push for Social Security. You're going to see the welfare state, kind of as we know it, right? The welfare state. You're going to see a lot of these programs that come out of the 1960s. Again, you have the emphasis on helping the poor. That was something Kennedy talked a lot about. Well, Lyndon Johnson's able to get a lot of those things done. As a matter of fact, more legislation will be passed. So he'll be president for 1.5 years at the end of JFK's term. He'll win re-election in 64. So he'll serve a total of 5.5 years. He will pass more legislation than any other president other than FDR. Okay, so FDR was there for over 12 years. So any other president that served 8 years did not get as much legislation through as Lyndon Johnson did in 5. So just very, very powerful, effective from that standpoint. Also very aggressive from the political standpoint. When we start talking about kind of presidents that really push their way and are very aggressive in legislative agendas, Lyndon Johnson's going to be one of the ones that's most aggressive. But notice this shift that we've talked about here already. Okay, we've talked about from the 1950s a president like Eisenhower, who was a very more hands-off president that was pushing to grow infrastructure, that was really foreign policy stability, lack of getting involved in a lot of foreign affairs unless just absolutely necessary. And now you're having this more aggressive view of Kennedy when it comes to both foreign and domestic policy. Okay. Any questions over the political view of the 60s before we talk about the election of 1968? Do you want to get some feedback from you guys? I know we're moving rather quickly, and I'm trying to keep it at a high level just so then we can back up and review. Any questions at this point, as I've kind of covered now 1, 2, 3, and 4, as we're going to get into kind of the end of 4 and 5. All with me, right? Okay. All right. I'm seeing some nods. All right, we're going to go. So 64 is an interesting one because when Johnson runs for that election, he runs against a really conservative candidate named Barry Goldwater. Lyndon Johnson crushes him, okay? One of the bigger presidential beatdowns. But it is interesting that you have a really conservative candidate that has a really hard time getting ground, right? Saying, hey, we don't need Social Security. I think that we've gone way too far when it comes to the Great Society programs, and he's just not very effective on the political scheme, in the political scheme of things. So enter 1968, okay? In 1968, you're going to see quite a combustion of different events that occurs. First of all, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which causes a lot of strife in the country, the civil rights movement, but really just the country. You're going to have an assassination of Malcolm X. You're going to have the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy is JFK's younger brother. Most people assumed he was going to be president in 1968. He's gunned down in LA right after a speech. He wins California in the primary and gets gunned down in his victory speech right after it in LA. And so who's running for president? Well, the Democrats are really struggling to find that candidate with the death of Robert Kennedy, and the Republicans settle on Richard Nixon. So he's back, okay? So after losing in 1960, he's back in 68. He wins a pretty substantial victory in 68, and he really runs on a pretty conservative platform, but his foreign policy is basically this: I'm going to win in Vietnam, and I'm going to win quickly. Okay, so it's not we're just going to leave. It's we're going to leave quickly, but we're going to win quickly. Okay, and so what you're going to see from Nixon is this foreign policy that's going to be an extensive bombing of Vietnam. an extensive bombing of Cambodia and Laos, the countries around Vietnam, which get Nixon in a lot of trouble, a lot of hot water. But from a domestic standpoint, what you're going to see from Nixon is some fairly conservative policies, but then some policies that are going to be pretty popular amongst Democrats as well. He creates the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, again, that's not something that you would typically think would be a kind of conservative, position, but he does that. We also see during this time a very fascinating foreign policy of trying to get a agreement with China to go against Russia. I can't remember if we talked about that on Tuesday or not, but that is a huge strategy that ends up paying off for Nixon. So he is going to actually land in China, talk to China's president, Mao Zedong, and enter into an agreement with him that we're going to at least kind of maintain neutrality. So that's a major win for him. Nixon's actually going to expand Medicare, Medicaid. Again, kind of this moderate president, right? Not overly conservative, but pretty moderate. 1972 wins a landslide, only loses 2 states. Okay, so wins this huge election, 1972. So honestly, if I could stop time in 1972, Nixon has a lot of conservative appeal. He can describe himself as a conservative. He did certain things that were conservative, kept tax rates low, things like that. But he did things that appealed to moderates and liberals as well. Incredibly popular, only loses 2 states. You'd think he's like probably, if we stop time, was on pace to be one of the most popular presidents or most effective presidents in American history. Well, things are about to change rather dramatically from this point, because something else happens in 1972. There's a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. Why is Watergate Hotel important? Because the Democrat headquarters was meeting there for a short amount of time where they were planning the campaign strategy in 1972. So there's this break-in. Has anybody listened to the podcast Afterburn? They have one on Clinton, and they have. I would highly encourage you guys to do it, especially with, especially if impeachment kind of comes back up, that there might be another attempt to remove President Trump. But just in the light of the impeachment, it's fascinating. They go through the Clinton impeachment and they go through the Nixon impeachment, and they talk about kind of how everyone found out about Watergate. And they do a great job of just old interviews. But yeah, it was a really popular podcast earlier in the year. But as they find out that some of the people who broke in had connections to the Nixon campaign, people begin to ask questions about, so were they actually spying on the Democrat Party, on the Democrat strategists? Which, by the way, in a ironic twist of fate, so Nixon, the name of the group accused of spying on the Democrats is the group to re-elect the president. Okay, so the title of that group, what's up, Antoine?
What's up?
The title of that group is the Committee to Re-elect the President. So let's look at that acronym. The acronym of that group was CREEP, CREEP. Okay, so what do you know? The guys that are in the group called CREEP end up spying on their political opponents, right? Just crazy. So anyway, there's another weird angle of this. There's a plane that goes down downtown New York City, just a commercial plane. And when the plane crashes, they find a suitcase with over $100,000 in non-sequential bills. And one of the people on this plane was the wife of one of the people who broke in to the Watergate Hotel. So why was she carrying in a briefcase all this money? So obviously you can see there is something going on here. There was obviously an attempt to spy on the Democratic campaign for president, but the question quickly begins, what did the president know and when did he know it? Okay, was Nixon in on this all along? Was this all part of his plan? Did Nixon know about it later but cover it up? This begins, and guys, this is the 70s, okay? So politically speaking, you really begin to see people start distrusting government. Okay, if this is what they're doing, if there's spying going on, if the president's covering up for the spying, how can we trust the government? You see the War Powers Act come in. He was also secretly bombing 2 countries. So in the early 70s, people are really, this is the first time you see this swing where over 50% of Americans say, I don't trust the government. Okay, if you ask them in the 1950s, 1960s, you didn't see numbers like this. But in the 70s, Watergate, the bombing of Cambodia and Laos, you really begin to see people quickly turn against kind of this distrust of government. And so Republicans are in a really tough spot, right? So do you support a president that might have spied on his opponent? And so the reason Nixon quits, remember, Nixon's the only president to quit. He doesn't actually get removed, okay? He quits. He quits because he knows that the Republicans, they talk to him and say, listen, as a matter of fact, Barry Goldwater is the one that comes and meets with him and says, hey, like, we can't support you anymore. Like, I can't vote for you to stay in office. There's just no way. Like, it's going to look bad on our whole party. So Nixon steps down. His vice president, Gerald Ford, takes over. Gerald Ford is just really known to be a guy that didn't ruffle any feathers. He was a football player in college, really well liked by everyone. He was kind of this big, I tell you that about him being a football player. He was kind of known as this like big jock. He was like a really big, kind of muscled up guy. And so he comes in, he's president, 1976. Again, just to show you the distrust of government, Jimmy Carter becomes president in 1976, Democrat from Georgia. He basically runs on the whole, like, I'm really not a politician. Like, I'm really not. Like, I am a peanut farmer, okay? I was governor for a little while, but, you know, I'm a Southern Baptist preacher. Like, I like to preach at Southern Baptist churches. And he wins this election in 1976. That just shows you how much people were so frustrated with government that they were like, absolutely, give us the guy who says, like, he's just not a politician. That's who we want right now. And so you just see this distrust of government that really comes up in the 70s. And also, again, I know that Mr. Caldwell mentioned this on the last call about Vietnam. In 1975, again, as you see Congress during all this time, what do? You know, we got a president we really don't trust. And as Ford comes in, I mean, we're still in Vietnam. We still have a large amount of troops there. And Congress votes to pull the aid and say, we need to start bringing troops home faster. We need to really get out of there. And we see an overrun of Saigon. We see the northern troops overrun the south, and we get out of there as fast as we can and try to save as many of our allies as possible. But it's overrun, and so that's where Vietnam gets swallowed up by the communist forces there in 75. So that brings us up to 80. And I don't really want to get too far into this because you're not going to be tested over this, okay, on the AP exam. I'd be more than happy to go through the 80s and 90s with you more in depth later if that's some of an interest for you guys. But in the 80s, you have Ronald Reagan elected, and you see kind of an attempt to rebound the economy, which happens midway through his first term, and a very, very conservative president, Ronald Reagan. Okay, very, very, one of the most conservative in modern times. And you see the end of the Cold War at the end of his term. You see an economic rebound through the beginning of his term, and you see a slight recession in 87, 88, and then we see his vice president become president, and then we go into President Clinton, and then we see another big uptick in the economy under President Clinton, and then we can kind of get close to modern times. So before I back up and do some high-level discussion about politics throughout the time, do I have any other questions, comments at this point about what we kind of covered to get post World War II? I just covered a lot really quickly. I just covered a lot at a really, really quick pace. So I understand if there's just kind of tough to know where to start from, but I would like to now back up if we don't have any quick comments here. By the way, if you don't follow me on Twitter, I don't know why you don't follow me on Twitter. I put it on the website, but there is a great, I'm going to put it on, I'm going to send out an email to you guys when we get off this call. There are several groups that do these, like they'll produce study guides. If you guys remember, and I think I've shown you guys at Millwood too, they make these big like study for the exam books and whatnot, and they charge you like an arm and a leg for them. They're like 30 or 40 bucks. Well, there are several companies that are now giving them for free, like the PDF. And so I'm just going to like send you all a link with those on there. So if you want to like click over to them and just see a quick study guide, I found two yesterday that are available. So I'm just going to send that out to you guys. So if you guys want to flip through that and see if that's helpful. The other thing that I wanted to tell you guys about are the crash course videos. I know a lot of the students had me last year, remember me kind of referencing those, but John Green does them and they're much higher quality than like what I'm doing, right? Like much better production value. I think you guys will probably laugh at him more than you laugh at me. Yeah, it's really good. It's really well done. And they're like 10 minutes a piece, right? And he, like I said, he's really funny too. But he does them with the AP standards as well. So I mean, it's actually in line for the test. So I highly recommend those videos as well if you want kind of that type of overview there. So let's back this up. So let's go back to the very beginning. Let's talk early times. Let's talk George Washington. Let's talk John Adams. Let's talk about the political scene then. So I do want some kind of feedback here. Talk to me about what the political spectrum looked like back then. If I had to take you through from the very beginning, and we're talking about political movements, what's the early political movements that we see around the time of the Constitution?
It's a really good question. Wish I had an answer for you.
You have like a strict interpretation, and then you got like a loose interpretation.
Exactly. So what you're going to see, right, is when you look at the Constitution, you got a group that says you got to abide by this very strictly, very, very small government, very agrarian. Remember, Thomas Jefferson is very much like, hey, we all need to be farmers, right? And remember, the view is like, hey, if everybody has farmland, then hey, they can make their own crops, so then they could sell them for money. Like they're set. So like, let's stay agrarian. So small government, agrarian society. That's your Jeffersonians. On the other hand, you have the Federalists. That's Alexander Hamilton. Okay, so hopefully by this point, especially since y'all been on quarantine, y'all have all watched Alexander Hamilton. So that definitely should have happened, or at least listen to the songs. But I'm sure y'all can find it bootleg somewhere because it's like everywhere now. So, but that's awesome. I had a bootleg, but they took it down. Probably shouldn't admit that, but yeah, but they took it down. So Hamilton wanted the big industrial country. He wanted us to look very much like Great Britain was in the early 1700s, and a more powerful government. Hamilton, they don't cover this in the musical, but Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention kind of makes this long speech about like, we need a really powerful president. And we need this really mobile government that can really do things really quickly, and like no one hard says anything. And Adams kind of gets up and says, okay, well, not exactly like that, but we can have our own version of a presidency. But I mean, yeah, Hamilton wanted this really powerful government with a economic engine. And as we see, I mean, honestly, so. I mean, are we like a really agrarian society now? Or are we more industrial? Like, I mean, Hamilton's view more came to fruition than Jefferson. So now let's move on. So that's kind of your early back and forth. So what happens after that? What's our next big political movement? Talk to me about Jackson. What do you guys remember about I mean, they literally call the 1820s, 1840s in your textbook the Jacksonian era. I mean, we don't call the early times the Washington era or anything. I mean, he so dominated politics in the 1820s and 1830s that, I mean, they call it the Jacksonian era. So, well, what was that? What did that era look like in politics? If I had you describe Jackson, what did Jackson believe in?
Slavery.
Slavery. Remember, well, slavery was part of his whole very powerful government. I mean, he believed yep.
Founded the Democratic Party.
Yes, yes, there you go. Very good. As Antoine said, what you see with Jackson is he believed in the will of the people, right? He was the first truly Democrat. He's the first president was truly elected by the people. So when he comes in, he says, look, people voted for me. So because people voted for me and they didn't, hey, you senator from Tennessee, so what? Cool. The people from Tennessee voted for you. The people of America voted for me. So when I come in and tell you that we need to do A, B, and C, that means we need to do A, B, and C. And by the way, don't tell me I can't do A, B, and C unless the Constitution says I can't do it. Great point there, Maria. Indian removal. Again, you see him do things that were at the time, and I've talked to you guys about this before too with Indian removal. Indian removal, as terrible as it was something that was popular at the time from a lot of people. So Jackson was like, well, hey, if a lot of people want to do this, then I'm just going to do it, and when the Supreme Court says, you can't do that, that's a violation of their civil rights. Jackson says, well, let them enforce it, right? Like, let them stop me from doing this. This is a view of a very powerful presidency. As Antoine said, it's a democratic presidency. It's a presidency that, hey, because I'm elected by people, by the entire country, I should have a lot more power. And if the Constitution doesn't tell me I can't do it, then guess what? I'm going to do it. So now moving into, we're talking about the 1850s, 1860s. To Antoine's point about slavery, this is where we begin to see slavery really begin to be the issue in the country. Mr. Kurtz, who opposed him on the Indian removal?
Yeah, I'm seeing if I can answer that question.
Yeah, so who did we see opposing him on that issue of Indian removal? You guys remember what the opposition was? You had a lot of people in the West that were opposed to it because he's moving them out to the frontier. Okay, you had some of the Republicans that were opposed to it because they felt like it might interfere with their industry. But for the large part,
federal territory west of the Mississippi River for white settlement.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, the people out west that are trying to settle are going, wait, you're going to move them out here? Well, we that's what we were doing. That's what we had set up. So you're going to see that political block come out against that. So now I'm talking 1850s, 1860s. Again, slavery is the big issue, right? I mean, that's really, you can put a lot of these political disputes based on, are we going to have slavery or not? Are we going to expand it? Are we not? Are we going to make it illegal or not? And so you see in the North, the belief is the federal government has the right to make that decision, okay? In the South, you have the belief that that's up to each state. Now, I had you guys do a discussion on this and a debate on this. Again, you're going to have people argue back and forth. Was the Civil War really about states' rights or was it about slavery? And again, my question I always ask students, and again, you can kind of answer this how you will, but if it was states' rights, it was states' rights to do what, right? I mean, it really came back to slavery most of the time, right? So you did have a lot of people in the South that did believe the North was being aggressive toward them, that jump on the bandwagon there in the Civil War. But yeah, I mean, slavery is the political issue of the time. I mean, it's so bad. If you guys remember the gag order in the 1950s, Congress passes a law that says you can't talk about slavery in Congress. Like, how silly. They're like, hey, well, when we talk about slavery, that's all we ever talk about. We don't get anything done. It's like, well, maybe you should get something done. Maybe that's why that always happens. But anyway, so slavery is the dominant issue, and you have the side that believes that the federal government needs to make the decision and needs to outlaw it, and you have the group that says, hey, we need to push this back to the states. Post 1850s, 1860s, if we get into the 1880s, 1890s, what do we see? It's the Gilded Age. What's the Gilded Age about, if you had to sum it up as a political movement? What does the term Gilded Age mean? Does anybody remember the term, where it came from?
Gilded things weren't really like super fancy. They just seemed like it on the outside.
Very good. Yeah, it's that Mark Twain quote, right? You know, Mark Twain gives us that usage of the term for the age. But yeah, I mean, it looks good from the outside, but it's really not on the inside. So it's really this view. The Gilded Age is a lot of people that thought that legislation needed to favor business, because the more business grew and the more money businesses had, the more it helped the whole country. Okay. Then you had the other side, which believed, listen, businesses are taking advantage of people in some situations, so we need to regulate business. That is going to be the fight back and forth between the 1880s and really up to the early 1900s, right? So think about the Gilded Age as big business. You kind of have the wealthy, that again, and by the way, I'm not trying to make it sound so one-sided, right? Because the wealthy do have a good point in that, hey, well, we created a business that employs thousands of people that now they have jobs when before they didn't have jobs. You know, they were just farmers. They choose to come work for me. So there's a good argument back and forth on, are the wealthy benefiting all of society, right? And then you have the other side, which is like your unions that are coming up that are saying, hey, we want certain rights, we want certain restrictions on what the business community can do. So that's really your back and forth. That goes all the way up to the early 1900s when we see the progressive era. Also remember, there's that weird argument about monetary policy. I know this makes everybody get real excited, right? When we talk about monetary policy, that's always everybody's favorite. But you had people that supported the gold standard. Here's what I'm just going to give you the quick takeaway. The wealthy tend to support the gold standard. They wanted all of the money backed up by gold. Okay? Because just think of it this way, the less money there is, the more valuable that money is. So the wealthy that already have a lot of money tended to not want more money in circulation. So the less money there is total, the more valuable it is. I always give, y'all probably gonna look at me like I'm stupid for using this analogy because nobody does this anymore. But back in the day, it used to be a big deal to collect baseball cards. Okay. The key to finding a good baseball card to collect was on the bottom, it told you how many of them they made. And if you had a card that said it was 1 out of, 3,000, okay, whatever. But if you ever got a baseball card that said it was 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 4, all of a sudden you could look that card up and that card could be worth a lot of money. So that's kind of where that comes in, is the less money there was, the more it was worth a lot. And so the wealthy tended to want the gold standard, those strict restrictions. Poor people throughout the country wanted silver. If y'all remember William Jennings Bryan talking about, we want silver also. Why can't silver back up our money? We want more money in circulation. That begins to be a big argument as well during the time. And then we talk about the progressive era. How would you define politically the progressive era? What do you remember, like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson? What did you see them championing politically?
I could be totally wrong, but isn't it social programs?
Yes, social programs are part of it. Absolutely. You're also going to see this change in progressive politics. Okay, so by that, what I mean is you're going to see things like the recall, like the referendum, like the 17th Amendment, which allows states to elect their senators directly. You're also going to see prohibition, the banning of the use of alcohol. It's a much more aggressive government solution oriented time. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, his doctoral thesis is basically the founder screwed up. Okay, the government needs to be bigger and more aggressive. And that's, I mean, if you had to encapsulate the progressives, they believed that to make progress, the government needed to be very aggressive and act that way. And by the way, that was Republicans too. I mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, a self-proclaimed progressive. He was a Republican. It's a really interesting time that this one political movement really takes over both parties. Both parties say they're progressive. It's very kind of strange, unique in American history. So you have that, and then you have, okay, in the middle of World War II, right before World War II, we have a Great Depression, right? And so you have two competing schools of thought on how you deal with the Great Depression. You have the Democrats that favor a much more robust government programs to give directly to the poor, give jobs directly to the poor. And then you have a more Republican view that there should be a hands-off approach, okay? Low taxes, less regulation, let the economy build in that way. You see it before and after the Great Depression. The two parties are kind of defined in that way. By the way, now we're getting closer. Now that I'm talking, you're probably going, okay, that kind of sounds more like, you know, closer to what our modern parties are, right? You know, you kind of have the Democrats that tend to want, and again, I'm speaking in generality. I don't mean every Republican thinks this or every Democrat thinks this, but Democrats tend to want a bigger government that's more direct programming for people. Republicans tend to want a smaller government that's more hands-off, right? Just, again, speaking in generalities, doesn't mean they're always that way, but that's your 30s and 40s. We move into the 50s and 60s. Remember, the 50s are really strange because both parties like Eisenhower. So again, we have this weird moment where Eisenhower's kind of middle of the road. So the Republicans are kind of middle of the road. So the Democrats are kind of middle of the road. So the 50s are this kind of more moderate time. Then you move into the 60s and you see this, I mean, they just really break apart. You have the Republicans that go, they want to be really conservative in 64. The Democrats want more social programs in 64. Lyndon Johnson wins that election. And so then really, we really similarly see that to this day, that you're going to see the definition of the way the two parties go post-World War II. Democrats want to grow the social programs. Republicans want to scale them back or at least freeze them. And we see that movement post-war in the political scheme. Again, I want to be very clear. I'm speaking in generalities. It doesn't mean every Republican thinks that way or every Democrat thinks that way, but just as we're looking at political trends, that's what we see. Okay, so we're here at the end of the call. Like I said, I know that's a really quick high-level overview of politics, but again, I want to get back into things in detail later, so I wanted these first few calls to make sure that you guys got it from a really high level and at least had a general overview of what's going on. Any questions or feedback for me here at the end of the call on anything that we covered today? And again, feel free. I got several emails afterwards about some things that we can cover at a later time. Any questions that you want covered, again, feel free to email me, tweet at me. You can put it in the chat here. You can mention it right now, but if you think of it later, just shoot me a message and I can be sure to cover it at the beginning of the call on Tuesday. So is there anything?
So do we do the assignments that are on Spark?
No. Well, I'm going to freeze those, Antoine, and I'm going to put these videos up, and you do not have to keep doing those.
Okay.
Yep, good question. Any other questions for me here at the end of the call?
Oh, did your bills ever get passed or went through?
That's a good question. So yeah, he's kind of asking about, so Antoine was actually Speaker of the House up here in Oklahoma City. So I got to give him some mad props for that up here in the student government. But yeah, so the legislator came in this morning and said they're going to call an emergency session, special session for Monday, and they're back in regular session on Monday too. So there's actually going to be 2 sessions going on up here at the same time. So yeah, I have 3 pretty big bills that are still alive that trying to get through the legislature.
All the House and senators will be back at the Capitol?
They will be, but the rest of us are locked out. So like you have to be a representative, a senator, or on their staff, or they're not letting you in the Capitol building, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll be able to get in.
Yeah, you try to sneak in. Yeah, you do that. So yeah, they're supposed to be taking everybody's temperature at the door too and everything.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Carnes is mentioning on here a Vietnam War video. Oh, that's a great point. Guys, Netflix has some great, any of the Ken Burns documentaries are awesome. His Vietnam War one is amazing. He's got one on Prohibition too on Netflix. So you guys, this is also what I was going to do. I know y'all will absolutely take me up on this. You better. So what I was thinking about getting together a list, Mr. Carnes, maybe you and I can do this. I can get with Miss Hunt and Mr. Hampton too. But I was going to do like some good historical movies that are on Netflix right now and just kind of share it out. And so students, if you guys got bored, you might be like me, like I'm rewatching Tiger King, you know, like that's kind of where I am right now. So if you're in that space where you're like, hey, I don't know what to watch on Netflix or something, there are some really good documentaries, and there's some really good just like historical films on there too, that I think you guys really enjoy. HBO's got a great documentary on Martin Luther King Jr. That I don't know if I've ever seen put together. It was him before he kind of became the civil rights leader. It's called King in the Wilderness. It's really, really, really good. Anyway, so I think I'm going to do that. I'll share that out too. So kind of in closing here, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get off a call pretty quick. I've got a 3 o'clock I've got to get to. I say get to. I just got to sit here in front of my computer and talk to people on the same thing. The crash course videos are great. I'm going to start sending those out again. In the next email I give you, I'm going to give you this list. The movies that are good for you to watch. Again, I have the videos. I pulled them out of Spark, so you guys don't have to get back on Spark all the time. And I just put them on the website. So if you want to watch, you know, if you need more of me, right? If you want to listen to me ramble on more, you can do that. But then I'm going to give you the high level production of like I said, John Green is a lot more entertaining than I am. And I'm going to give you some movies as well. And I'm going to link these study guides that are now free. So I'm going to make all that in a really easy spot for you guys. So I just want to put it on an email. I'm putting as much of it as I can on my website, that front page, so you guys can just click around real quick and everything else. So, all right, guys. Well, if that's it, I'm planning on next Tuesday, 2 o'clock, unless something crazy happens. And again, if you guys need another time, if you guys want to do a morning time to cover any of this stuff, feel free to shoot me an email with any suggestions like that. And if there's any resources you guys find, please share them with me as well. Thanks everyone for joining the call. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Stay safe. Okay. And I'll talk to you soon.
All right.